I'm here, George, if you want to introduce our speakers.
Yes, well, it's a pleasure to welcome everyone to our last session. Well, our last session will be on Damascius' first principle and the Ismaili Neoplatonism. We have two experts to guide us to that topic. Sara AHBEL-RAPPE, professor of Greek and Latin at University of Michigan. Well, she's people know her for her work on Neoplatonism and on Damascius in particular. Especially that translation of Damascius has been very useful to everyone. Thank you, Sara, for being with us. And Salman, thank you for joining us on a topic about which I know very little, namely Ismaili Neoplatonism. We are looking forward to your talk. There has been a handout in circulation, so I guess, well, your talk will rely on that. So the floor is yours to, yes.
So we agreed that, can you guys see me or hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so we agreed that Salman, I would talk for about 10 minutes and then Salman would take over. So first, I just want to thank Luciana and for setting this up and inviting us. And I also want to thank Salman, from whom I've learned so much about Ismaili Neoplatonism. So I'll just start now. And I should have a handout with 3 passages from Damascius. But if not, then I'll just go ahead and read them out. So in this paper, my colleague, Dr. Salman, Amir, and I examine the function of Damascius's philosophy of the ineffable, the areton, in light of Ismaili theologians whose strict observance of Tawhid, the assertion of God's oneness, often employs similar designations for the supreme. It's ineffable, unknowable, utterly transcendent, not a cause, etc. Salman's work on Ismaili Neoplatonism affords us a perspective wherein Tawhid, the faithful acknowledgement of God's oneness, and the resultant obligation to abandon every form of shirk, of associating him with another, vitiating his oneness, is intellectually conversant with the metaphysics of transcendence found in Plotinus and Proclus through Arabic translations. Now, a puzzle in Damascius scholarship concerns how to interpret Damascius's areton. Is it, in fact, a principle? Does it perform a function within a metaphysical system? Or rather, in expressing the transcendence of the areton, is Damascius cautioning us to avoid associating the transcendent with any other, for example, as a cause to its effect, or even as the ground of causation? I hope to frame this puzzle in a way that will perhaps parallel some of the discourses that we find among the Ismaili theologians, such as al-Sijistani, al-Kirmani, and al-Hamza, that Salman will explore. And at the end, we hope that you will discuss with us what we can learn from this comparison with Ismaili and Damascian attempts to preserve the transcendence of the first principle. So in this part of our joint presentation, I'm simply going to revisit the question of the very purpose of Damascius's operatic treatise, the Periarchon, the De Principiis, in light of recent scholarly approaches. In the Periarchon, Damascius attempts to raise a succession of operatic inquiries that, taken together, surround the ever more complex constructions of Neoplatonic ontology, infusing the magnificent descriptions of his predecessors with a kind of hesitation. This hesitation, the ability to follow through the dialectical implications of a given position to reveal its limits, is most like the effect produced by the Socrates of the operatic dialogues. Problems and Solutions simultaneously offers a nearly exhaustive critical précis of Neoplatonic ontological architecture, as well as a method designed to question the very explanatory principles by which reality devolves into that architecture. If procession, remaining, and revision are the 3 moments of a great universal pulse in which all beings manifest the potency of the one. They are equally, from Damascius's point of view, untenable mental constructs that apparently violate a kind of Occam's razor, canceling each other out and leaving the theory of cause itself as a mangled and broken crane overlooking the ruins of the metaphysical tradition, over 1,000 years old by the time Damascius wrote. At least, this is how I understand the problems and solutions. Despite the word solutions in its title, the work is fundamentally operatic and so punctuated with the vocabulary of puzzlement, aporia, and helplessness in the face of this aporia that we do need to ask about the function of aporia itself in this treatise. So I would go so far as to say that in the operation of the periarchon, there are two fundamental engines that drive the discourse. One of them is odus, labor pains, the inability to know, to bring forth the absolute. And the other one is aporia. And insofar as these lexical functions punctuate the periarchon, they point to a Socrates, not a Socrates who wrote nothing, but a Socrates whose highest wisdom consisted in the realization that he had no wisdom. In this respect, the radical critique of the metaphysical enterprise as such that we find in Damascius offers its adherent an inoculation against the fever of arrogance, the intellectual pride implied by any attempt to create a conceptual icon of reality. How long have I been speaking, you guys? Wait, can you tell me just how many minutes?
Well, you have now talked for 7 minutes.
Okay, then I'll just finish up. Okay, I was going to go into specifically these two basic interpretations of the periarchon, and let me just give this quote from Maître Tresson. She writes, for the aporitician who is Damascius, it is not a question of opposing one doctrine to another, or of preferring one conception to another, but of detecting the limits of all conceptions of the absolute. And for this first passage on the handout, I'm going to refer to Vlad, who write in her book, Damascius and the Ineffable, that Damascius sees discursive formulations, including first and foremost, descriptions of the absolute reality in light of Neoplatonic psychology, thoughts, that is to say, intentional states of mind directed towards states of affairs in the world, are technically a species of probole. Quite literally, they are projections onto a larger reality from the viewpoint of an individual isolated mind, conditioned by intellectual habits that are framed in dualistic terms. And Damascius writes in 188, if one compels this projection to teach us concerning that principle, it will project a secondary or third conception in place of itself, a conception that, in alleging that the predicates that belong to the one altogether at once are, on the contrary, distinct, appears to reveal that principle by saying, for example, at first, that the most simple is a principle, and then that which is first is a principle, and that which embraces all things, and that which gives rise to all things, and that which all things seek, and that which is most powerful. But all of these are just ways of grasping the one. They are, as Damascius writes, and this is the second quote, a form of hyperactivity that stops on the threshold of the mystery without conveying anything about it at all. So I feel like I'm kind of running out of time for the rest of my presentation. So I'm just going to skip to the end and simply conclude by saying that by simply saying that Damascius, the last pagan professor, is ironically, perhaps from our perspective, telling us as emphatically as he can not to worship idols, and that metaphysics can be a form of idolatry. Therefore, if one does practice philosophy, we must practice it in aporia, in humility, in reverence, having purified ourselves of all of our own thoughts. Okay, thank you so much. And now Salman is going to take over.
Thank you,
Yes,
Sara.
thank you, Sara, so much. I was my internet connection was frozen, and I needed to change a room. So thank you very much. I couldn't hear everything you said, but I of course read your paper. And thank you, Luciana, for having us, and thank you everyone for listening to our presentation. So as my colleague, Professor Sara AHBEL-RAPPE, presented, in shedding light on Damascius's concept of the ineffable first principle, we find intriguing parallels and contrasts that enrich our understanding of divine ineffability across cultural and philosophical traditions. In this exploration, my colleague, Professor Sara AHBEL-RAPPE, explored Damascius's concept of the ineffable first principle, while I delve into the perspectives of al-Kirmani and al-Sijistani, the Ismaili philosophers from the Fatimid period, the Fatimid Empire, examining their critiques of the theory of emanation and their assertion regarding God's causal agency. I want to share with you my slides. Let me just see, where is that? It's here, okay. Second. This is the slides. So let's go to this one. Okay. So God is unknowable, imperceptible, incomprehensible, and ineffable. The primary tenet of Islam, known as al-Shahada, entails the profession of faith in the belief that there is no God but God. This declaration, also denoted as the word or verse affirming the unity or singularity of God, serves as a foundational aspect of Muslim belief. Within the Quran, God is depicted as both concealed and beyond sensory perception, a theme reiterated across various verses. Concurrently, God communicates with his creation through a veil, imparting glimpses of his mystery. Despite his transcendence, God maintains proximity to the earthly realm, possessing omniscience regarding even the minute occurrences. The Ismaili philosophers, exemplified by figures such as al-Sijistani and al-Kirmani, encountered difficulty in reconciling the Quranic portrayal of God as both apparent and hidden. Their primary concern lays in preserving God's absolute transcendence, achieved by assigning his apparent aspect to the initial created entity, the intellect. Consequently, in al-Kirmani's Rahat al-Aql, his magnum opus, the divine entity Allah of the Quran, described in the Quran, transformed into the intellect. Central to Ismaili theological discourse, alongside that of other Muslim theologians, was the endeavor to harmonize God's transcendence and unity with the numerous attributes attributed to him in the Quran. Additionally, they grappled with reconciling his incomparable nature with verses describing his actions using human language, a method prone to anthropomorphism, which is called tashbih. The purpose of Ismaili Tawheed, meaning confessing the oneness, ineffability, and unknowability of God as an act of worship rather than philosophical inquiry, is to emphasize the incomprehensibility of God to human understanding. It aims not to prove God's existence, but to dissociate him from any connection with the created universe. Ismaili thinkers criticize the method of ta'til, which strips the concept of God of its content, attributing its use to Mu'tazilites, Sufis, and Islamic philosophers, as well as to Greek philosophers like Plotinus and Neoplatonists, who employed the via negativa, while the via negativa suggests that God can only be understood by what he is not. For Sufis and Neoplatonists, it offers an alternative path to understanding God. The via negativa does not result in agnosticism, but rather it provides another path to comprehending God. If God cannot be perceived by the intellect, then a mystical experience, or in Arabic, dhawq, taste, would draw the seeker to the supreme reality. Al-Sijistani, rejecting mysticism, proposed a twofold negation to assert God's absolute transcendence, which is called in Arabic tanzih, removing associations both with the physical and the intellectual or spiritual realms. Al-Kirmani adopted this approach to purify Tawheed, aiming to extricate God from human intellectual speculations. Both authors emphasize that God cannot be apprehended by the senses or even by the intellect. His first creation, with revelation being the sole source of knowledge about him. In Al-Kirmani's work, particularly in his Rahat al-Aql, the concept of Tawheed holds a central position. He emphasizes the transcendence of God, asserting that conventional methods of understanding and knowing cannot be applied to him. God, being beyond both intelligible and sensible realms, eludes human comprehension, imagination, thought, and language. His essence is self-identical and wholly distinct from all other entities. The luminous power of God's essence renders speech, thought, comprehension, and imagination inadequate tools for apprehending him. Al-Kirmani posits that conventional methods of perception and understanding are inadequate for comprehending God, who transcends sensory and intellectual realms. He argues that if God were perceptible, he could be grasped through familiar methods, such as, we know that from Aristotle, such as definition, division, analysis, composition, and demonstration. However, Al-Kirmani contends that defining God would confine him to corporeal limitations, which he surpasses. Moreover, God cannot be subdivided or composed, as this would imply imperfection. Al-Kirmani rejects demonstration as a means of knowing God, asserting that God's transcendence precludes logical deduction based on premises and conclusions. Since God surpasses sensory and intellectual comprehension, conventional methods cannot reveal him. Consequently, God remains beyond linguistic expression, surpassing all attributes and eluding human understanding. In this regard, Al-Kirmani echoes Plato's concept of the ineffable one in Parmenides. Quote, consequently, it cannot have a name or be spoken of, nor can there be any knowledge or perception or opinion of it. It is not named or spoken of, not an object of opinion or of knowledge, not perceived by any creature. End quote. Al-Kirmani asserts that God transcends sensory and intellectual apprehension. He employs a double negation to cleanse the concept of God from attributive contamination, emphasizing God's indescribability. Language, limited to intelligible and sensible realms, fails to capture the essence of God, who exists beyond these categories. In Al-Kirmani's view, the highest degree of perfection and magnificence pertain only to created beings, not to God. Attributes denoting perfection and divinity belong to the first created being, the intellect, rather than to God. Al-Kirmani contends that Tawheed involves not only negating attributes from God, but also attributing divine qualities to the intellect. The term in Arabic, ilahiyya, signifies the intellect perplexity in understanding its creator. And of course, this goes against what Plotinus talks about, the regression or going back to the creator, rendering the name Allah of the Quran exclusive to the intellect in Al-Kirmani's philosophical framework. Now the question is God a cause? And this is our main concern here. The assertion of God's unknowability, imperceptibility, incomprehensibility, inimaginability, unrecognizability, unperceivability, and ineffability leads to a fundamental inquiry: can such a transcendent entity be considered the cause of causes, the principal cause? Both Al-Kirmani and the Sijistani employ a strategy of negating all causality from God in order to preserve his transcendence and establish a clear discontinuity between the creator and the created. This theological stance enables the Ismaili authors to assign the designation of the first cause or cause of causes to the first created entity, namely the intellect. In al-Yanabi', al-Sijistani cautions his audience against seeking any essence or inherent nature, ipseity, quiddity, that predates the intellect upon its manifestation. He asserts that the divine command or the word of God serves as the cause of the intellect. Furthermore, he contends that upon the manifestation of the intellect, the word and the intellect become unified, sharing the same essence. Al-Sijistani maintains that the word exists solely within and in union with the intellect, implying that it is a quality exclusive to the intellect and does not emanate to its effect, the soul. Al-Sijistani unequivocally denies that God is the direct cause of the intellect, arguing that attributing quiddities to the ultimate originator would necessitate a causal chain. Consequently, he identifies the intellect as the most noble entity possessing a quiddity, with its quiddity being caused by the command of God. Al-Sijistani's position posits that the word of God does not establish an autonomous hypostasis between God and the intellect. However, he remains elusive and ambiguous regarding the ontological status of the word. He refrains from elaborating on the word status, suggesting that it unites with the intellect upon the latter's manifestation. This implies that while the word and the intellect may be perceived as distinct entities in thought and language, ontologically, they are considered one and the same. Thus, Al-Sijistani's treatment of the ontological status of the word appears to present challenges lacking in definitive explanation. Al-Sijistani employs the aforementioned argument as a polemical tool against Muslim philosophers. In his Kitab al-Iftikhar, particularly in the chapter dedicated to Tawheed, he challenges the philosophers' characterization of God as both a substance and a cause. Additionally, he refutes in his Al-Maqalid the assertion of Muslim philosophers regarding God's nature as a substance and a cause. The philosophers, in contrast to the Ismailis, posit God as the primary cause with the universe as its effect. For instance, Al-Farabi states, quote, "The first is that from which everything which exists come into existence," end quote. while Ibn Sina contends that, Avicenna, contends that the necessary being is, quote, a first absolute cause, which is the cause of all other causes, end quote. In his counter-argument within Al-Maqalid, specifically in chapter titled, quote, that God is not a cause, end quote, As-Sijistani argues against the application of causal laws to God, which would imply that effects necessarily proceed from causes, thereby alluding to the emanation theory. However, this theory contradicts the concept of creation ex nihilo, that advocates instead for creation as an act willed by God. As-Sijistani notes that agnostic philosophers assert God as a cause due to their belief in the eternal and perpetual nature of the natural world. According to him, each cause is inseparable from its effect, and cause and effect manifest simultaneously. If God were a cause of eternity, the world would coexist eternally with him, negating his role as a creator. Conversely, if God becomes a cause at a certain point, another cause must precede him, rendering him an effect of that prior cause, which is deemed absurd. Thus, As-Sijistani concludes that God is not a cause, and the cause of causes is his command, specifically the intellect. All effects are attributed to his command, which grants them part of what is inherent within the causes themselves. This continuity, that is, the causes always give the effects a part of what is already in themselves, poses a threat to Tawheed, comprising God's transcendence and imperceptibility, and introduces duality within him, where cause and effect cannot be distinguished in a being devoid of matter. As-Sijistani emphasizes the importance of understanding causes and effects to recognize that God is neither a cause nor an effect. Let us now explore Al-Kirmani's perspective on the causality of God. Interestingly, he seldom directly addresses this subject in his writings. Nevertheless, he consistently emphasizes that the primary cause is the intellect, عِلَّة أولى in Arabic. At the outset of his discourse, Al-Kirmani delineates two distinct paradigms concerning causality. One pertains to the natural world, while the other pertains to the realm of the intellect. In the latter context, the intellect, he asserts that due to the absence of materiality and multiplicity within the intellect, the conventional distinction between cause and effect becomes untenable, in contrast to its applicability in the natural world. The sequence of cause and effect cannot extend infinitely. It necessitates a primary cause that is not itself the result of a preceding cause. This primary cause must be self-existent, deriving its perfection solely from its own essence, without reliance on external causation. Such a cause, existing independently, requires neither antecedent causation for its fulfillment nor a material substrate for its instantiation. This unique causal agent, preceded only by the exalted himself, is identified as the intellect. And this reminds us of the unmoved mover of Aristotle. So if we can see that the Ismailis also are very close to the way Platonists think, especially Damascius and Plato, about the ineffable, about God. Al-Kirmani critiques As-Sijistani's proposition as previously elucidated, wherein the word of God is posited as distinct from the intellect, contending that such differentiation is fallacious. Instead, he posits that since the word represents the initial cause, it is more accurate to assert that the essence of the effect is congruent with the essence of the cause, and vice versa. Within the intellect, the delineation between cause and effect dissolves. The first created being emerges as both the primary cause and the initial effect, without any discrete demarcation between the two. Although the intellect emerges as the effect of its own essence, it remains contingent upon God, functioning as both the initial cause and effect proceeding from the exalted. Despite assuming roles as an agent, command, cause, and creator, Al-Kirmani contends that these attributes cannot be attributed to God, who serves as the principle of the intellect. Al-Kirmani emphasizes that the concept of creation ex nihilo, positing that all existence originates from the divine act of creation, the divine act of creation. In his work, Rahat al-Aql, he asserts that the first principle designated as the primary intellect and being did not self-generate, but rather emerged through the divine act of creation. Al-Kirmani underscores that the intellect devoid of prior existence manifests through the creative and transformative process instigated by the divine. In his endeavor to expunge causality from God, Al-Kirmani critiques the theory of emanation. Al-Kirmani's critique of the causality of God extends to a systematic dismantling of the theory of emanation. In his work, Rahat al-Aql, he devotes a chapter specifically titled, quote, "The intellect came into being from the exalted, not through emanation, as the philosophers claim, but through creation," end quote. Within this chapter, Al-Kirmani meticulously elucidates the fundamental disparity between ibda', which is creation, and emanation. This critical examination is further delineated into distinct sub-arguments. First, he contends that emanated substances share the same genus and essence as the source from which they emanate, thereby participating in and corresponding to that source. Drawing on the analogy of the sun, he illustrates how the emitted light shares the essence of the sun itself, suggesting a potential multiplicity within the sun. However, Al-Kirmani asserts that such multiplicity implies a dependence among the constituents of a being, necessitating a unifying power to maintain coherence. This notion contradicts the fundamental principle of God's unity and self-sufficiency, as posited in Islamic theology. Furthermore, Al-Kirmani argues that if emanation were the mode of creation, it would imply plurality within God and necessitate a superior principle preceding him, a notion incomparable with monotheistic doctrine. Consequently, he concludes that emanation cannot be the mechanism through which creation occurs, giving the indivisible unity and self-sufficiency of God. Second, Al-Kirmani argues that emanation necessitates an emanating entity with a complete essence. However, he posits that God transcends attributes of completeness or completeness itself. Were God to possess completeness, this attribute would be shared with the intellect, which itself possesses completeness as an attribute. This sharing of attributes implies a correspondence between God and the intellect, suggesting the existence of a third entity preceding both. However, Al-Kirmani deems this scenario untenable, leading him to reject emanation as the mode of creation from God. Lastly, Al-Kirmani's critique extends to the implications of emanation theory on the nature of intellects descending from the first intellect, including those of prophets, founders, and imams. He argues that if the first intellect were indeed emanated from God, then subsequent intellects would share its genus and completeness, akin to divine attributes. However, Al-Kirmani maintains that these intellects, the intellects of prophets, founder, imams, while revered, do not surpass attributes and acknowledge their incapacity to describe God beyond negating attributes. Consequently, if even the first intellect cannot attribute qualities to God, the theory of emanation appears invalid. Al-Kirmani concludes that creation ex nihilo is the sole alternative, emphasizing the limits of intellect in comprehending the creation process. Ultimately, by rejecting emanation, Al-Kirmani underscores God's transcendence, affirming creation as an act of divine will beyond causal constraints. This endeavor aligns with the overarching goal of preserving the purity of Ismaili Tawheed from conceptual impurities. In conclusion, the discourse surrounding God's causality encapsulates profound theological reflections on the nature of divine transcendence and creative agency within Islam. Through the lens of Ismaili philosophy, exemplified by the works of al-Sijistani and al-Kirmani, we encounter rigorous intellectual engagements aimed at elucidating the intricacies of divine ontology. Their critiques of the theory of emanation underscore the imperative of preserving God's absolute transcendence, affirming creation ex nihilo as the sole mechanism of divine agency. By situating God above causality and attributing causal efficacy to the intellect as the first created entity, these thinkers navigate the complexities of Islamic theology, striving to reconcile scriptural mandates with philosophical inquiries. Ultimately, their endeavors serve to deepen our understanding of God's ineffable essence and his role as the ultimate source of existence, transcending human comprehension and linguistic expression. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation. And I don't know what we are going now, but I invite all of you to ask questions. And I think I would love also to hear your opinions about what you heard, because some of you said that this is the first time you hear about the Ismaili Neoplatonism. And I ask Professor Sara AHBEL-RAPPE also to join me in answering the questions. So back to you, Luciana.
Yes, thank you very much. I just want, if you cannot share, yes, like this, I can also put Professor Sara AHBEL-RAPPE in the screen. I just want to apologize, George. He has to get out a little bit before, but he wrote in the chat the first question, and he says, one question is, how can we know that the first cause exists at all if we cannot know its nature because of its transcendence? I don't know if you can read it in the chat.
Yeah, I can't read it. I can't read it. But from an Ismaili, Sara, maybe you start with Damascius, if you would like.
So I think this is a question that the reason why we wanted to have this conversation is because, you know, people have said that Damascius is ineffable is the ground of causation, and that essentially Damascius can be reduced or brought into line with the project of metaphysics, which is discovering the cause of everything. And my point in that sense, what I was trying to say is that in a way, the ineffable is not a principle. it is not a cause. That's the point. So George's question, how can we know the cause without knowing its essence? No, we can't. We can't know the ineffable, and the ineffable is not a cause. I think that is what Damascius is saying in the very beginning. He says, you know, if the transcendent is the cause of something else, it's no longer transcendence. Its transcendence is vitiated through its implication with a system. And so in that way, I think the Ismaili position is very much the same, right? With al-Hamza and
yeah, I think exactly this is the point of view of the Ismailis about God. So we know according to the Ismailis that there is a God, there is a first thing, there is an ineffable, there is something that is transcendent, but this transcendent thing relegated, according to Al-Kirmani, its power, its causation power. It's the first causation is not in God himself. Actually, it's in the intellect. And the Ismailis want to purify this concept, that language would contaminate even this ineffable. If we even talk about it, we know that it exists, but we cannot talk about it. And let me ask even a question that is self-answered. When we know as humans, we are curious. We are humans in our nature. We are very curious. We want to know always. If we know God, the first question that will come to our mind, what created God? What was before God? What came before God? So God wanted himself to be out of this field of us knowing too much. And this is actually brings people into this, the so-called religions, to stop the philosophical inquiry and be humbled with this thing that created everything and be connected through our intellect to the intellect itself. And to know God as a cause, as Sarah said, we will never know this cause or this cause, or God is not a cause, as the Ismailis say. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's as George said, I know very little about Ismaili philosophy, so it was a great opportunity for us to see the link. I will put a question, very basic one. Which kind of historical links could have between the Neoplatonic texts by the Ismaili? Have them read it, and which one?
Yes.
Can we...
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a very good question, actually, and it was explored in scholarship. So the Ismailis who lived in the Fatimid Empire, they, especially the thinkers, al-Kirmani, al-Sijistani, there were another two thinkers, one of them Abu Hatim al-Razi and al-Nasafi. Now, they belong to the so-called Persian or Iranian school. This school they translated the Enneads, which we know today to be the theology of Aristotle. And they also translated parts of the elements of theology of Proclus, which is called today the Liber de Causes. And this is what we call the harmonization and reconciling philosophy with religion at play. So they reconciled this corpus and the knowledge that they have from this corpus, the Neoplatonic corpus, they reconcile it with Islamic theology, and this is what we received. So Al-Kirmani went against all his religion. Al-Kirmani said, the Quran, Allah, we read about Allah of the Quran. Allah of the Quran has a lot of attributes. But this made Al-Kirmani think, okay, where are we going with that? But we say Allah is transcendent. Allah doesn't have attributes. So Al-Kirmani said in his book, Rahat al-Aql, Allah is in the Quran is not Allah that we are talking about, that Plato talked about. Allah of the Quran is the intellect. And this is amazing to say something like that. And actually, he was expelled from the Fatimid Empire back to Iraq because he actually confused the believers. And al-Sijistani also, he had another connection to Neoplatonic philosophy, and he wrote about it in his books about his connection to the belief of reincarnation. He also was killed. So these philosophers are unique in this regard, that they actually brought to us back to the arena components of Neoplatonic philosophy, but imbued with Islamic revelation. And this is the outcome. So we're still preserving some Neoplatonic components also today in my religion, the Druze religion. So the Druze religion, the Druze who live in Syria and Lebanon and Israel, they still believe in components of Neoplatonic philosophy, like reincarnation, which they took from Iamblichus and Porphyry. They believe in the oneness of God as Plato believed in it, as al-Kirmani and al-Sijistani talked about. So this heritage of Neoplatonic philosophy, which came from Damascius, from Proclus, from Plotinus, from Plato, through the Islamic philosophy, and was suppressed by Islam in the Middle Ages, it is still actually a living tradition in the Druze religion, in the Druze communities, in Israel, in Lebanon, and in Syria. And this is something very unique to talk about and to bring it into academia. And this is why I did my dissertation about the Druze religion, to see which components are still living there. And these two components, the oneness of God and reincarnation, are still living in the Druze religion.
Oh, it's really interesting. Do have some questions in the room, maybe?
Yeah, please. We are happy to answer
I
the
know
question.
that we are more. We know the audience knows more Neoplatonism than Ismaili philosophy, so I think they don't have to be shy to put questions.
Yeah.
Please, Stefan, get
So
in.
yes, thank you for your paper. I have a question regarding the role of Porphyrius in this history, this migration of the text between the Greek culture to the Arabic, but also to the Islamic culture, because calling the Quranic God as Nous, it reminds me as the tentative of Porphyrius to call the God of the Old Testament as demiurge or even the Nous. So it's more or less the same philosophy, the same approach. So I know that in the Liber de Causis and in the theology of Aristotle are a lot of Porphyrian philosophy, not just Plotinian one. So which is the actual debate about this issue? It's about the role of Porphyrius into the translation of the Greek philosophy to these authors that you mentioned.
Yeah, I personally do not know a lot about Porphyry's role in the transition movement and whether his texts were translated. What I know about the translation movement that was established by Al-Ma'mun, the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, and by Al-Kindi, they really translated the Enneads, some parts of the Enneads, I think part 3, 4, and 5, and some parts of the elements of theology of Proclus. But as you see, these ideas, even in Islam, they were split into two different schools. And actually, I always see that as these schools that permeated Islam, they actually came from Plato and Aristotle. So what I mean by that, when we say Aristotle, we talk about the unmoved mover. And this is exactly what Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, the philosophers who took this stance of Aristotle, whereas the Ismailis took the other stance. They went deeper and they looked at the philosophy of Plato and the philosophy of Plotinus and the philosophy of Proclus, and actually they created a different path, a different school. And we see it, it's still here. So this is why we have Sunni and Shia. The Sunni, exactly, I see it like that. Sunnis went after Aristotle, and Shia, in a way, went after Plato in the philosophical orientation. We know today that this is not the case, right? But in the Middle Ages, this was the case in these traditions. Now, Porphyry, I don't have a lot of knowledge, but my colleague Sara, please.
I haven't really investigated the place of Porphyry's, for example, maybe his launching points, or, you know, in that tradition of the theology of Aristotle. I mean, I agree with you that these disputes about whether or not the one can be equated with the intellect, I mean, those kinds of disputes you do find, for example, in the anonymous commentary in the Parmenides. And, you know, I mean, I agree with you, those are disputes that, in a way, they're parallel discussions. But I guess what we're trying to do is bring out, and I'm not saying that Damascius is in any way an influence, but rather that what I'm suggesting is that this conversation with the Ismailis maybe will help us think about Damascius's ineffable and this compulsion to turn him into a metaphysician. And the idea that unless he's actually doing something and somehow grounding causation, or that his system is related to the theory of causation, that you know, we won't be satisfied until we see him doing that. But what I'm suggesting is that in reading Damascius's Doubts and Solutions Concerning First Principles, he's not just picking a cause and saying it exists at this level or that level, but rather he's saying that I'm tired of discussing cause. I don't want to, that's not what it is to encounter the ineffable. That notion of cause, you projected that. You know, that will not encompass God. That will not encompass the divine. That, you know, so our insistence to say, well, which is it? Is it Porphyry? Is it Plotinus? No, the answer is none of the above. That's how I see it. But, you know, you may disagree.
No, I don't. It's okay. No, but I see that in the actual research, I think that Christina d'Ancona has write a lot about the transmission of the Greek, so the classical Neoplatonist, Plotinus and Porphyry into the Arabic language. And she make a lot of connections with Porphyrius. And this is something very, very mysterious, I think, for all of us. Huh? How can we identify Porphyrius in Arabic literature, in the philosophic literature? So it's a phylum of studies with a lot of possibilities and chance, but with a few answers. So I just was curious about this stuff.
I appreciate your question very much. I really do. And I'm sorry that I don't know enough about, you know, that specific area.
You know, just to add one more comment, yeah, let's leave Porphyry aside. It's a very interesting question, and I think a lot of you know, researchers are dealing with this even today. You know, look how many years passed, and we are still we still have we don't know a lot actually of what happened about the transitions and how it permeated the Muslim society. But one thing I want to just go back to the one and to explain a little bit about how Al-Kirmani sees this. So he says the intellect is perfect. The intellect is one by essence. The intellect is not multiple, is one by essence, but the intellect is multiple by annexation. And by annexation, he means attributes. So he says, when the intellect tries to go out, and because we want to connect this to Plotinus and the emanation theory. When the intellect tries to go out of itself to know its creator, it falls into ignorance. And think about it logically. The intellect is one unit. So if it tries to go out of itself, it will fall into perplexity. It would not know what's going on. It will not have itself as one. And this is exactly what happens to our mind. Our mind cannot go out of itself and see that thing and even call it a cause. So we know that it is there, but we cannot name it anything. We even cause is an attribute. We don't want to give it any attributes, not complete, not cause, not because it's not intelligible and it's not sensible. So you know what? I want to say one thing. I am so happy that God created me in this way and limited my mind to a level that I do not know more what I need to know. And this is to be humbled by this creation and love it and have always reflection towards what is it, why. And if we have 80 years and 90 years and thousands of years, it will not be sufficient because God actually is infinite. It doesn't have any time. And this is good for humanity to be humbled by this energy and say, you know what? Yes, it's there, but we don't know anything about it. And you know what? Let's stop even talk about it.
It sounds very, very Plotinian, so very, very Neoplatonic in a way. Yeah. So I remember that it's Porphyrius who said that the knowledge of God is actually a not knowledge, a non-knowledge. This is again typically a Porphyrian, and it's a Neoplatonic issue, of course. So thank you for your answer.
Oh yes, of course. You know, we are also, Sara and I, we are also grappling with these facts and this knowledge. And we also, you know, when we talk, we think about it. We say, oh yeah, you know, it's very important for us as humans. This is the intellectual inquiry. You know, it's all about this, where it's taking us, how we can think about it. Because we don't want just to write about it and make a paper and put it in a book or publish it. No, we want to be as humans the vehicles of this knowledge because this knowledge has a lot of love, a lot of compassion, and we need to transfer this knowledge to other people, to our communities.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I feel that that also another dimension of this project is to get to the essence of what you've said. The project is about religion and about philosophy and their emergence. And so I think that Damascius, in a way, he's written this very critical metaphysical treatise in which he's sort of gone through the essence of Proclus's theory of return and shown that it's incoherent, and in a way has left us with kind of what Salman says, devotion. I mean, to the one. It's I think that he's exploring the depth of what it is to be a philosopher, and that we, today we're struggling, with these theories, these doctrines, the theory of Proclus, the theory of Porphyry, the theory of cause. And but it's like, I think his point is that he's substituting an entirely different kind of activity. I wouldn't say that this is the whole point, that he says one must raise aporia on the basis of the underlying realities themselves, and that the aporia should concern the depth of these realities. So it's in that opening the mind of inquiry that releases itself from all of these human schemes. That's where we are, trying to find the ground of this activity. And in that way, I would say that Damascius is not really giving us a first principle, in the same way that the Ismailis are not telling us that God is a first principle. That's our problem. That's our hubris. That's our idolatry that needs to be tamed.
Yes, I like that, Sarah, to be tamed, because we humans, we need to sometimes to be tamed in a way that we need to stop. Al-Kirmani says, you know, when the intellect tries to go out of itself, and we connect that back to Plotinus, to the reversion, uh, that does not mean in no way does that mean that the intellect is imperfect. When the intellect tries to go out of itself to know its creator, and it can, it doesn't mean that it's imperfect. No, it is perfect, but this is the way God created it, from that genus, that it just cannot go out, because God wants to be by abiding by himself. And this is great. And we have to respect that. You know, we have to get to that place to say, you know what? I am limited. I am limited. I can go. I am limited. And again, humans first want to know, we want to know God, but at the same time, as in Delphi, they wrote there in Delphi, know thyself. You know, we don't know ourselves yet to know that transcendent and ineffable. So this is all related. This is in the core of our humanity, who we are, what we are, and why we are. And these questions are all connected. In a way, this is philosophy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Please, Jean Daniel.
May I just raise a very small question, which is a little aside from the main discussion? I'm supposed to participate in a colloquium in 2 weeks' time on Christian Apocrypha in the Quran. And I'm puzzled by the way the crucifixion of Jesus is presented in the Surah 4th, 155-57, where Jesus is not crucified.
Oh, yes.
I was wondering what you think of that passage, because I don't know much about Plotinus. I know even less about philosophers in Islam. I know a little more about Gnostics. And the Basilidians in the 2nd century presented Christ as a nous. And this is not at all the main line of thought of the Christology in the early church. So I was wondering if you had an interpretation of why Jesus was not crucified.
Yeah, this is a very, very nice question. I want to say I am sorry that I do not know why the Muslims have this surah in the Quran. Uh, but I can say from the perspective of the Druze religion that also in the Druze religion, and I think in Ismaili literature, Jesus is depicted as the nous.
Yes.
Yeah, it is there in this way. However, I really don't know why in the Quran Jesus was not crucified. I think we need
But
yeah,
a
yeah,
nous,
I do not know.
a
Yeah.
nous cannot suffer.
Oh, yeah, maybe, yeah. I don't know. But even the nous doesn't know the Father in this way. Like if we
Yeah.
connect this to Christianity, even the nous just can talk about the Father, but it doesn't. The nous, he, she, it doesn't matter. The nous does not know the Father, and it's yearning to know the Father. And this is very interesting. You know, these perspectives and the research we are doing, you, Sarah, I, all the people here, it's very fascinating that we can, bring these ideas and bring to life these people who wrote about all these religions that we are still today. We ask ourselves, I am Christian, I am Jewish, I am Muslim, I am Buddhist. So everyone has their orientation. But in a way, we are all of us going to one path, one way. We are looking to that truth. There is one truth. And but again, I'm very sorry that I can't give you an answer to.
No, but
Yeah.
it's already an answer.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. You're welcome. My pleasure.
There is more questions in the room. So maybe I will thank again Sara and Salman for this inspiring exposition. Thank you very much. And see you soon, maybe in our next meeting in Frascati. We'll try to do it on live as we are doing now, even if we'll be there for the first time together, the 5 of us, the organizers. It will be our first meeting in person, and we will have some invitees from Italy, but we will try to make also a double version, let's say. And I hope it works and you can also get in the discussion. Thank you very much again.
Thank you, Salman.
Thank you soon.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.